Well, that's a good question. I don't know how anything sort of arises in a linear way at all. It's very much, it's not just the object of an investigation as like the end of it being the city or an experience of a city. It's also the process for me. So usually for me, it's about an interaction, a dialogue, a fantasy, if you will, between a number of people and myself, and sort of having an idea of interacting with a number of other arenas other than art, which, for instance, for me might be architecture, politics, entertainment, the idea of the commercial, industrial graphic design interests me. There's a lot of different arenas that I think are sort of subject matter, or that not even just subject matter, that they're sort of arenas that I can learn from and bring over the strategies from those areas and bring them into my work. So for me, the films are sort of like almost like an excuse to do that, if you see what I mean. The process of doing the films, because films are extremely collaborative, very high speed, usually quite expensive, compared to painting, which is very slow, very monotonous, on the whole pretty solipsistic. So you have these sort of two completely different temporal realms, which are dependent on each other. I wouldn't be able to sit around and make as many phone calls as I do, or talk with as many people as I do, if I was making a different type of painting. The painting that I do lends itself to the films, and the films lend itself to the paintings. And in a way, they're both a series of coordinates, and they're both unresolved. Sometimes a lot of the conversations I have in order to make a film yield an image at the end. They lead me to an image. Perhaps I'm talking to a gatekeeper of some sort to try to get a camera into a particular room or into a particular situation which I desire. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But even if it doesn't yield an image, it yields an approach to the image that I'm interested in, and sort of informs everything that I do. Like, I mean, it even informs perhaps the titles of the paintings. It might inform a particular sort of beige that I keep using in a lot of the Beijing work. Do you see what I'm saying? It's all like interrelated. It's not just the object of a inquiry, it's a process. Yeah. Well, how do I register my perceptions? I just register my perceptions with a camera. So that's how my perceptions get registered. How they get edited and shaped and streamlined obviously happens, months after the film is shot. But in terms of like the registry of perceptions, which is a great sort of phrase, the registry of perceptions just happens when I decide to turn the camera on and off. And usually these things, even though you speak of social sciences or, sort of urban theory, a lot of what perhaps captures my eye is various details which could become sort of narratives, which is actually much closer to fiction. Well, I mean, that is also a very good question. I mean, between there's sort of two poles that go on in the work, or basically at large in my studio and in sort of my entire operation. One is a sort of extreme exertion of control, and then the opposite, which is complete lack of planning and sort of improvisation. And so some things that register as an image obviously cannot be planned. They cannot be, there's no direction involved. If you see, Henry Kissinger sort of behind George Bush at a basketball game, I mean, I had no idea that he would be sitting there like that. I did know that Henry Kissinger was in town, and we filmed him earlier that week. But so there's certain things that are absolutely what I would call like coordinates that would be like, I guess, on a list or on a treatment before I actually shoot a film. There's sort of almost like a desired situation, a desired situation of which I would like to be in, or I would like to sort of portray. If I have a feeling about a place, about what I'm trying to suggest or what needs to transpire, I will look for those scenarios. So the idea of filming Kissinger giving a speech called "What Makes a Champion" would be exactly the type of thing I would be looking for, but I didn't script it. It simply exists in the world, and that's why. Perhaps a reference for me, aside from somebody like Rob Grier, would be somebody like J.G. Ballard, with this idea of using basically reality as fiction, using characters that exist as fictive possibilities or narrative possibilities, and again, it's like it's very clear, it's open, it's an open text. There's no, because if it was a documentary, if there was sort of an object of inquiry, it'd be a very different sort of process. And I'm not really interested in documentaries because I actually don't believe in any sort of, I honestly don't believe in any form of objectivity. Well, there's a lot. I don't know if you really want to hear them listed. The color palette for every series that I do is quite specific to a number of things, and they range. Again, going back to this idea of multiple arenas that sort of intersect, which seems to be a constant focus of mine. This idea of like a never-ending interface that's constantly going on. It's not only the process in which I work, it's also the image rendered by my work. Is this idea that, I mean, even if it's a painting, that it can go on and on and on, that actually it doesn't end where the painting ends. It can go on into space. And this is what you see with the wall painting, the Taurus wall painting, and this is what you see when you see the way a city unfolds, and this idea of the decentered city, which I think actually at this point every city could be defined that way. But I forget the question. What did you ask? Oh, the color. Yeah, the color, it ranges, again, going back to these different arenas. I might look at political propaganda. I might look at magazines. I might look at cigarette packs. Like, for instance, let me show you something. Like, this is one of my favorite cigarette packs in China. This color, it's called Lesser Panda. And this beautiful color, sort of turquoise, is in a lot of the work. And also, here's another one where you have this type of red, extreme red. Sometimes, so again, they come from sort of packaging, industrial design, mainstream media. They might come in, I might look at architecture and how the scaffolding is colored there, or how the sort of typography is set. It's one thing that we were looking at. Basically a range of reference materials. It's almost like, I don't know if you know that film, Powers of 10 by Charles and Ray Eames, but you know, the scale goes from huge extremes of scale in terms of where the references come from. I mean, they're as minute as a cigarette pack, and they're as large as you know, very large structures of architecture that are in the city that are really dominant, or the way the tile in Tiananmen Square is colored, this sort of sandy red, this sort of the way colors there, even if they're primary, look dirty or dusty or sand blown. That effect of sort of sun and pollution on the bright is something that I was really intrigued by, and also, I have to say, sort of repulsed by. Wow, there's a lot of, I should send you some books for the room or something. You know, it's so many books. I couldn't, that's like saying, name everybody who you've met in your life who would be an influence or some sort of, that crossed your path. It's sort of like a Douglas Gordon piece or something. It's like, I don't know how I would possibly quantify sort of what my reference points would be. I can tell you, though, that I definitely was, you know, I would say I was strongly influenced by the approach that I saw in literature by Rob Grier. I also was really strongly influenced by some of the ideas of new journalism that Joan Didion put forth in the sort of 70s. The idea of like a lack of an objective voice, and how to sort of how to make specific details resonate or have narrative possibilities, or even this idea of mixing fiction and reality that someone like Truman Capote, who's somebody who I like very, very highly regard when he wrote In Cold Blood, were sort of seminal works that I definitely think influenced contemporary art and were important for this idea of an approach that was not simply expressionistic, or was not simply based on the idea of a simple political truth, that there's actually much more complicated forces. But, you know, I mean, I also think film is extremely important. We were mentioning literature, but actually film, if I think about, you know, film when I was growing up in the sort of 70s and later, it was all, I mean, it all seemed like Watergate came about as an effect, as an aesthetic effect, actually, that you can see in really fantastic films, from everything from The Conversation to The Parallax View to a number of films that Pakula made, that you see this sort of buildup of the idea that the surface, that reality has to be looked at as beyond the surface, that the surface contains these contradictions, but that ultimately will betray those in power. That idea really fascinated me, and those moments, this idea of like the failures, these sort of systematic dominoes of failures that happened, I think were very important for my generation's approach to making art, because I think you look at the idea of one simple truth, or the idea of how to sort of put together a story, or how to put together like an image, people were quite suspicious about. I mean, because there's already this idea that like the document or the recording, we all know, I mean, is manufactured. You know, one book that I thought was really interesting that actually was highlighted by this professor of mine, Stephen Heath, at the same time that he introduced us to the work of Rob Gray was Umberto Eco and the role of the reader, this idea of things being open, this open narrative and this is extremely important, obviously, that we can come up with many parallels to this in contemporary art, but the idea that the viewer projects, like a screen, projects upon these images or these ideas, like how they view representation, how they view power, how they view the other. Well, this is a really important, I mean, this is really super important sort of concept. And I mean, there's been a number of artists that have played with it and used it and played with this idea of a system. But I do like this idea of creating a system, and with my work, almost like a system of rules that I can sort of stick to, and then it's actually quite open therein. Like if I make this type of painting that's actually like very math-based, very coordinate-based, and at the same time extremely subjective, and also sociological, and also playing with graphics and sort of forms that we're quite familiar with. At the same time, it allows actually the structure of the painting and the temporal space of the painting allows me to think about the film work, the type of situations I want to find myself in. And also, more importantly, the references for my work, like the idea of, in a strange way, the films for me are a way of not only creating this like highly subjective fantasy world, but they're also a way of me containing or keeping control, maintaining control of the references in my work, or at least divulging a number of references in my work that at the beginning I was wary to sort of let anybody else sort of mention. That I actually when I shot Midtown, I was like, you know, actually I really want to make a film about 6th Avenue, that sort of canyon on 6th Avenue where you have this sort of lineup of these corporations, and what would it be like to sort of occupy them? What would it be like to sort of, when I say occupy them, I mean visually. I sort of view that consumption happens on a visual level, and that when you consume visually, that there is no boundary between private and public. And this idea is quite political, and I like this idea of collecting and also manufacturing these sites, these spaces of power that we all sort of occupy. They're ours. They're not actually anybody else's. They're ours. Yeah, sometimes sometimes you know, it actually is too many people, which is the opposite of what I say. I'm much more. I mean, most artists don't like sort of working with so many people, or at least a number of people I know are sort of more. They like to be more self-dependent, self-reliant, but. For me, it starts with the idea of the process of like finding out about a place, and obviously the idea before finding out about a place, I have some very set ideas that are almost like what Martin Amis would call SF, about like what I think I'm going to look for in this place, and so I'll have a list of places in that city I want to be, whether it's the cabinet room of the White House, or whether it's like listening to Henry Kissinger and having to deal with him, or the presidential lounge of the Bird's Nest, or, you know, I mean, the list goes on. But anyway, these sort of situations, to create a list of situations of what I want to be in. So how I'll go about doing that is I don't have it in the studio anymore, but usually there's a list of names on the wall. And those list of names represent people I want to talk to. and people I want to engage in the film, not necessarily to work with me, but definitely to have conversations with and about what I'm trying to achieve with the film. So that process of the conversations takes, I don't know, like several years to have all of these different discussions, dinners, drinks, phone conversations. That's one phase of things. Then there's like the scouting phase, which usually I do, in this case I did with 2 different assistants. And over the course, again, of 2 years, going to Beijing and having those conversations with all of those people. And sometimes it would yield, what was very tricky about making the Beijing film is there were a lot of yeses that meant no's, and there were a lot of no's that actually meant yeses. And it was this crazy, bureaucratic language, which I wasn't at all familiar with, that actually drove me completely crazy at times. I really did not think that what I wanted to do would be possible. And it was only like 6 months, maybe even 3 months before that several of the concrete no's became yeses. So anyway, there's this process of this sort of dancing around the target and then getting closer, closer, closer. And then at the same time, talking with some production people who are based in the place that, that we want to film in. And talking, so we were talking for a couple of years before the film was shot with a guy named Michael McDermott, who is a producer in China, who actually did The Inconvenient Truth. And he's an American who's lived in China for like the last 15 years. And he was told by a number of sources that he was the best at organizing stuff. And also, it has to be said, this was like the most difficult time to organize anything, because no one really knew what rules and what laws would apply. So no one knew, could you shoot in Tiananmen Square? Yes, no. And the conversations went on like this forever. So there's all of these like minute sort of logistical things that go on, and usually somebody else handles them, not me. I am aware of them all, but I'm not I'm not involved in all of that. I'm usually, what I am involved with is making sure that the main coordinates, like going back to this idea of coordinates, that the main coordinates, whether it's being present during the opening ceremony, or whether it's, as I keep mentioning, shooting Henry Kissinger, or all of these things, that those are achieved. Those are the things that I keep pressing on with. And so there's that. Then there's the still photography that has to happen during the shoot, and of course there's the music, which is very important, which is done by Liam Gillick, and the music, he'll have an idea of like this whole process that's building up over 2 years. So he'll know all of these bureaucratic frustrations and sort of, stunted or stilted conversations with these people, and the level of compromise that's involved with some of the people who have, commercial projects over there. And these sort of dialogues, how the dialogues perhaps reveal what cannot be said, and this, all of these sort of dialogues and conversations, and this all goes into the final piece. It all goes into the music of the piece, and then I'll take the music, which is done in a sort of modular way, which is laid out as perhaps like 40 different tracks or 50 different tracks, and then I will, with my editor, lay them out to sort of create this sort of, psychology of the future.